get rolling, guys. You know, this is something that's really been interesting to me for a number of years, Death in the Civil War. And I believe it all started with Gregory Coco's book, A Strange and Blighted Land, which talks about the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg. Federal burial details, burying the dead, what they witnessed, what they saw, what civilians saw as well. And it really made me think outside the box about historical interpretation. So I'm going to go over that. I'm going to go over where the ideas of the good death started, because that's something that you'll hear about from time to time. When I had Dr. James Broomall on, we talked about the good death. So where did this come from? Where did this idea originate? We're going to talk about that. And we're going to progress forward through history to the Civil War. Yes, we're not starting in 1861. We're starting a little bit earlier. Then we'll go into the war. We're going to be heavily focused on basically Antietam and Gettysburg. I'm an Eastern Theater guy. I'm also Yankees. We're going to study mainly Yankees tonight. And you're going to understand, though, that both sides had their issues with burials, and they handled it roughly the same way. So we'll go into that. And then, because I originally did this in Pittsburgh, I focused on Pennsylvania troops, and I'm from Pennsylvania. So I want you to remember that as we go forward and we talk about memory. So without further ado, let me get the PowerPoint up and we can begin, guys. I'm really hoping that everything works out pretty well with this. As I said, I'm on a 10-second delay, so I have to remember that when I go back and I see any of your questions or anything to that nature. But death in the Civil War and historical memory. And as I said, this is something which has been very important to me for a number of years. And it all started because I was an interpreter / reenactor, whatever you would like to call me. I did Civil War interpretation for a little over 25 years. I started out in the early 1990s, and I started by absolutely loving going to reenactments and doing battles and stuff like that. But as I got older, I started to realize that I felt a disconnect with the cost of the conflict. It was just numbers, it was just figures, and I wanted to do something a little bit more real, a little bit more raw. And I started to develop an impression based off of burial detail. Now, the photo that you see in the top right is a burial detail at Antietam in 1862. Obviously on the left is me with my burial detail impression, one of them. But that original image over there of Antietam really struck me because it was guys in the field, and it was real, and it was raw, and I really enjoyed that image. And I wanted to make that image come alive and get something a little deeper out of historical interpretation and Civil War reenacting. I didn't want to be just another person on the line firing a gun. I wanted to do something a little different and allow people to see something a little more deep and think a little bit more deeply about what they were experiencing. Yes, there was blowback from this. I did receive some dirty looks from reenactors, especially. I had one reenactor come up to me and flat out say, "You're ruining my weekend," because I was talking about the truth of warfare, which is death. But I guess I was ruining his good time. I had very little blowback from civilians and people watching the interpretation. But I did get the occasional group of people who would take a wide course around the area where me and maybe 3 other people were set up doing this. We never went out and did anything hokey, like put out something that had blood on it or had fake body parts or a fake body or anything. We never did anything like that because we figured that was too disrespectful. We don't want to tread that way. And we decided to go with just creating graves in the field based off of original accounts. And it really took off and really went well. And that's when I really started to get deep into this conversation about where did the beliefs that these men had about death and about the good death, where did they come from? And so that is why that I chose this topic. We can't start in 1861. We can't start in 1801, not even 1701. We have to go back to 1651. And we are going to talk about the rules and exercises of holy dying. Jeremy Taylor publishes this work in 1651. It becomes a classic by the time of the early 19th century and helps change the outlook on the good death. This is part of a 2-volume work. In 1650, he published the rules and exercises of holy living. So obviously, holy living comes before holy dying. Holy living taught the reader about leading a virtuous life, free of temptation. Holy dying was meant to help people prepare for a blessed or a good death, a peaceful death, surrounded by people you love, in your bed, without much pain. That's where this all originates from. So we have to not start in religious theory in 1840 or 1850 to find the seeds of the good death in the Civil War thought. We have to start in 1651 and 1650. So we have to go back 200 years and find it there. As you can tell, this was going to be a part of a massive class that I wish I could teach at the university level, where we would start way back in the 17th century and move forward through the Civil War about 19th century death and theories of death. So that's why I started way back in 1651, because you need to know where the foundations of these thoughts come from. Assumptions about these clean, good deaths were once held within the confines of the Protestant faith, mainly, but it had begun to spread into Catholicism and Judaism and in the mainstream of American life in around the antebellum years. Soldiers in the Civil War had been a part of or had descended from those who witnessed the Second Great Awakening, a religious fervor which stormed across America in the early 19th century. This event occurred from roughly 1790 to 1840 and advanced the ideology of having a personal relationship with God. Solely relying on a minister was to be a thing of the past. Revivals sprung up across many small towns in the heartland of America. Religious-based universities were founded at this time, and it helped to end the era of an American Enlightenment, which had gained a foothold during the days before the American Revolution. Spirituality and a closer connection to God was more defining than skepticism and even rationalism, byproducts of Thomas Paine and other noted persons of the Enlightenment era. This was mainly a movement, again, among Protestants, including Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. They were the driving force behind the Second Great Awakening. The idea that death was all around the soldier made many turn to religion en masse and religious texts. One soldier from the 114th Ohio, a private, said, quote, "I am trying to live a better man than I was at home. I see the necessity of living a Christian here, where they are dropping all around you." Another soldier was with the 4th Delaware at Cold Harbor, and he said, quote, "In that dreadful place, I resolved to forsake my evil ways and to serve God. I have done so, and I pray the Almighty to forgive me and make me pure from sin." Christian fatalism played this key role, and many times you'll hear a soldier say in his diary or in letters home, "If it's my time, let it be done." God also, to these men, willed the survival of the soldier. One soldier was with the 35th Pennsylvania. He was speaking on the death of his brother, who died at Drainesville in 1861. And this quote kind of says it all about this fatalistic idea. He says, quote, "His time was set by the Almighty man. He was due to die. And if he hadn't been killed on the battlefield, he might have died in the hospital or some other place. I think our time is all set when we shall die and before we want to die. And it makes no difference where we are." So there's that fatalism coming about. I'm either going to die on the battlefield on this day or I'm going to die at home. But that's the day I'm going to die. It's a fatalistic thing, putting trust in God's hands. And if it's my time, let it be done. A Michigan private also said, "I hope I will never get killed in battle, for I am afraid my chance for heaven would be slim." Apparently, he had done some things that he wasn't too proud about. Dying among family and peacefully was at the heart of the good death ideal. The Civil War and war in general turned this ideal on its head. Family now became comrades, chaplains, even nurses. Clara Barton spoke after the war of having to pretend to be a dying soldier's sister to make him feel at ease in his last moments. She spoke of not being able to bring herself to speak, but kissed him on the forehead so that, quote, "the act had done the falsehood, the lips refused to speak." Photography also opened a new door to this idea of being surrounded by family at the time of death. Soldiers who had died in battle could often be found by burial details clutching the photo of a loved one, thus surrounding themselves with their presence through the art of wet plate photography. One of the most famous being that of Amos Humiston, who fell at Gettysburg with a photo of his 3 children pressed to his body. The famous woodcut being shown there was a massive drive to showcase the last moments of the dying soldier, the death of a soldier. Amos Humiston was actually identified by media putting those 3 children out into papers. So you can see the power of identification also through wet plate photography and through the Order of the Good Death. Comrades writing letters home to the loved ones of the fallen was nothing new, but increased with the sheer amount of brutality and deaths during the war. Again, we see the good death playing out in the letters. Such phrases as, "Your son died valiantly, charging the enemy works. Your husband passed peacefully in a hospital, surrounded by soldiers of the regiment," and so on. We see these time and time again in primary source materials. This helped with the grieving process on the home front, even though the stories could have been dramatically fabricated. In most cases, the less families knew, the better, and some men kept it that way, or so it was thought. They wanted to keep it that way. One soldier in the 39th Indiana went so far as to make a pact with his friends in the unit. Quote, "We promised each other that if any fell in battle, we would see that they were assisted off the field if wounded, and if dead, to inform the family of the circumstances of death." One of the other underlying things that we hear about in a good death are final words. And sometimes this comes up in history that we hear of in the 20th century. What were the final words of this person? This can be traced back to the Order of the Good Death, leaving a message behind for those whom you love, or just your friends that you're leaving behind, your countrymen, etc. This is something that we read about very often. Final words come from the good death belief from 1651. Confronting death while being fully aware of your surroundings. That's synonymous with the Order of the Good Death. On the battlefield, the ground where they fell became a sort of deathbed for these men as they would succumb to their wounds. Hence, like the woodcuts showing the death of George Washington or John Adams, where they are surrounded by loved ones. The good death on the battlefield meant being surrounded by comrades to be with you and hear your last words, as if you too were dying at home in your own bed, surrounded by loved ones. For me, this is where death in the Civil War really began. A young man of 12, 13 years old, seeing the original images, being awestruck by them like people were when Matthew Brady first hung them up in his studio in 1862 and throughout the rest of the war, showcasing the dead of Antietam and later the dead of Gettysburg and so on and so on. The image on the left is a Federal soldier peering over the freshly dug grave of another Federal soldier. Meanwhile, the Confederate soldier still lies unburied. So that's something we're going to go over here in a little bit about. Whoever gets the field, whoever carries the field, also has the duty of burying the dead, and thus you usually bury your own first. Here's a photo that is like that. Again, on the right is a photo, one of the most famous from Gettysburg, from the Rose Farm area, with a number of Confederate officers lying out for burial. And this was a photo which took many by surprise at the time, because it showcased the brutality of conflict. So we rewind the clock from Antietam and Gettysburg, and it's due to the overwhelming amount of men who died at the First Battle of Bull Run. The Federal Army was ill-prepared to inter all these remains. In September of 1861, General Orders Number 75 was issued. This order made it the duty of the commanding officer to take the responsibility of any soldier who died in their jurisdiction, and to record the deaths to the office of the Adjutant General. So this is the early days of what we would later consider graves registration men. This is the first kind of order for that. Just over 6 months later, General Orders Number 33 comes out. This kind of edits the original order and explains it a little more. And General Orders Number 33 says, quote, "In order to secure as far as possible the decent interment of those who have fallen or may fall in battle, it is made the duty of commanding generals to lay off plots of ground in some suitable spot near every battlefield so soon as it may be in their power, and to cause the remains of those killed to be interred with headboards to the graves bearing numbers, and when practicable, the names of the persons buried in them. A register of each burial ground will be preserved, in which will be noted the marks corresponding to the headboards," end quote. So as you can see in these images, you see headboards and footboards in both of those images. However, in that order, I want to underscore two key phrases, and that is, as soon as it may be in their power, and when practicable. This is the leeway that some commanding officers need to be like, we'll get to that later, we need to move on, leave them there, or do it as quickly as possible, no concern about how it's done, it's not practical at the time, hence bodies get lost, hence unknowns, etc. At Antietam, one Union surgeon stated a week after the battle that, quote, "The dead were almost wholly unburied, and the stench arising from it was such as to breed a pestilence." The 130th Pennsylvania, a new regiment from the central part of Pennsylvania, who had just witnessed their first taste of war along the sunken road at Antietam, was tasked with burying the dead in that area 3 days after the fight. This was done, quote, "by reason of having incurred the displeasure of its brigade commander." So they irritated their brigade commander, thus you will bury the dead. Another burial party at Antietam decided they had had enough of trying to bury the Confederate dead and pitched 58 bodies down the well of a local farm whose owner had abandoned it just before the battle erupted. Burials were performed in various ways. It depended on the disposition of the body, tools on hand to complete the task, and generally the attitude of the survivors. As you can see, the different tools in that great Antietam image on the right-hand side that these men are going to be utilizing, the spades, the picks. It's one of my favorite images of the Civil War, only because it showcases how these Federals are wearing their uniforms, but it also showcases tools, etc. On the left are Confederate soldiers lined up for burial at Gettysburg. Using posts or fence rails to roll the dead onto stretchers or into pits was a very common thing. We find that happening on the battlefield at Gettysburg quite often. Stephen Osborne of the 145th Pennsylvania was assisting with burying a dead comrade on July 4th at Gettysburg, the day after the battle. His account is typical. Quote, "We had a stretcher of 2 small poles and some straps or body belts found nearby, and with Lieutenant Lynn and I behind, we made the trip by resting now and then. We were feeling very solemn and sad as we thought, But on reaching the place where they had just commenced the trench in which to bury the dead, they told us he was wrong end too. And on turning him around, one of the straps broke and pitched him all twisted up into a heap. This was more than Lynn and I could stand, and we gave vent to our grief in a roar of laughter. You say, oh, how wicked. All I have to say in reply is that we were in a wicked business, and it wasn't best for us to look at that side of the question or go without a good laugh too long at any one time. The dead were normally collected in one area of the battlefield or a portion of the field and then buried together either in a mass trench or in single fashion side by side. So in that photo on the left with the Confederates at Gettysburg, they are lined up for burial and they are ready for such an act. However, as we know from maps created by those who located or buried the fallen, many times men were buried where they fell. Sergeant Thomas Meyer of the 148th Pennsylvania said, quote, some of the men buried the dead thus laid in rows. A shallow grave about a foot deep was dug against the first man in a row, and he was then laid into it. A similar grave was dug where he had lain. The ground thus dug up served to cover the first man, and the second was laid in a trench, and so on. So the ground was handled only once. This was the regular form of burial on our battlefields. It is the most rapid and is known as trench burial and is employed where time for work is limited. So what he's saying is if we take that image on the left-hand side of the Confederates at Gettysburg, we take this first body at the bottom of the photo. On this side of his body, we would dig a hole 1 foot deep, a little bit longer than his body length. We would roll him into that hole, and where he was laying, we would dig another hole, take that dirt and put it in on top of the first man, and then roll the second man into that hole. Then where the second man was laying, we would dig another hole, and so on. So it's kind of like you're rolling these men down the line. So when all is said and done, on one end of the line is dirt from the first grave, and on the other end of the line is what looked like an open grave, but it's actually the dirt that has been taken into the final grave. This is what the manual pretty much told you how to do it, and it's very quick and it's very efficient. So this is a drawing of just a regular old trench burial. Dig a long trench, put the men into it. One chaplain with a Connecticut regiment stated late in the war that, quote, the best we could do in a brief interval of our stay was to bury our dead hurriedly in a common grave, in a long trench by the wayside, the officers by themselves and the enlisted men near them. So even in burial, you have this hierarchy of rank. The enlisted men, the privates to the sergeants, etc., are buried together. The officers, the lieutenants, the captains, the majors, they're all buried separately. Some soldiers use the landscape to their advantage, utilizing natural ditches as burial pits, then covering the bodies with soil gathered from each side. Most often, these trenches were marked with signs such as 80 rebels or 20 bodies. Coffins were out of the question on the field of battle. The best a man could hope for was to be wrapped in a blanket and to be buried by his comrades in case of his death, almost like a burial shroud. There are very limited instances where the body is stripped and then wrapped up in a shroud and put into the ground. That is very, very rare. Usually it's just men being wrapped in a blanket or even two shelter halves end to end, wrapping them up, tying them off, and putting them into the ground. To move a body days after the death was not a very easy task. Often bodies were bloated and filled with gases, which when released would make the job pretty disagreeable. Sergeant Meyer again commented on this. Quote, the stench on the battlefield was something indescribable. It would come up as if in waves, and when at its worst, the breath would stop in the throat. The lungs could not take it in, and a sense of suffocation would be experienced. Another soldier who was at Gettysburg stated, "Nothing could be more dismal and appalling than searching over a battlefield in a dark night for a friend or comrade, to turn up one dead face after another to the glimmering light of a lantern and see it marred with wounds and disfigured with blood and soil, the features perhaps convulsed by the death agony, the eyes vacant and staring. Dismal, too, the sight of the dark battleground with lanterns twinkling here and there like the wisp of the morass." That's a very deep yet dark look at what these battlefields would have looked like at this time. One of the most famous burials at Gettysburg, among those few of us who study this subject very deeply, is Private Albert Frost of the 3rd Maine. Killed on July 2nd, Frost's comrades sought out his body where they saw him fall. One member of the 3rd Maine actually recorded the incident. Quote, "We found him face down, with the flesh eaten in that hot climate by maggots, but not so bad that we couldn't still recognize him. When we went to bury him, all we could find to dig a grave was an old hoe in a small building. The bottom of the grave was covered with empty knapsacks. Then we laid in our beloved brother and covered him with another knapsack, and over all put as much earth as we could find. The grave was dug at the foot of a large tree. We then found a piece of hardwood box cover and cut his name on it with a jackknife and nailed it to the tree at the head of his grave." So you can see how they treated him. They may not have wrapped him in a blanket like a shroud, but they placed something down so he wasn't laying on the dirt, almost in a reverence of how great a friend he was. They covered him on top with a knapsack as best as they could. And he tried to take care of his body. Well, after the battle, embalmers began to ply their trade. Embalming was a new thing in America. It expanded greatly during the Civil War for obvious reasons. And soldiers' families often paid large amounts of money to have their sons, husbands, fathers embalmed and shipped home for burial. Carpenters obviously also saw a significant rise in demand for coffins, and local businesses did their best to earn a lifetime wage in a matter of months. So these bodies are shipped home, brand new coffins made, and these men are making a lot of money. So as I said, I originally did this talk in Western Pennsylvania, and as a Pennsylvania boy, I wanted to see what Pennsylvania soldiers had thought of their comrades falling around them, the memory. We talk about historical memory a lot now. It's been in the news a lot. We discuss how we remember the fallen. It doesn't matter whether it's the Civil War or the Second World War. We think about this often. So I wanted to dive into a few Pennsylvania regiments. These are Western Pennsylvania regiments, and try to see what they thought of sacrifice, their comrades' sacrifice. What do they see in monumentation and such? So we have to take a look at different days where monuments were dedicated, the speeches that were given, and they're full of patriotic fervor, but they're also full of historical memory of who they lost. September 12th, 1889 was Pennsylvania Day at Gettysburg. The state sponsored various programs and dedications for this day. So the state funded it, they hosted a lot of things, and there were a lot of speeches and monuments and ideas of monuments being pushed around on this day in 1889. Brevet Brigadier General J.P.S. Gobin spoke this day in the National Cemetery, which this is an early picture of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. Gobin said, quote, "But with reverent respect for all, we are today desirous of doing honor to the soldier of our own state. These are their monuments, These graves contain the dead of the state who fell upon this field. Men of Pennsylvania, they were of your flesh and blood. They went out of your homes. They battled for the preservation of your firesides, and the vacant chairs remain within your households. Their comrades claim them in memory and friendship, and it is a claim as far-reaching as the warm, throbbing heart of the soldier can make it. With tear-dimmed eyes, they range over this field as over no other spot in all the land, and would say to the trespasser, "Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." So he's talking again, just like Lincoln did in November of 1863 with the Gettysburg Address, about the land being consecrated by those who had fell there so many years ago. If you go to Gettysburg and go to the north end of the field, on the first day's field, one of the monuments that a lot of people visit is the 11th Pennsylvania Volunteers, mainly because of little Sally the dog. She was their mascot. You can see the men there in 1910, I believe that is, standing with their monument behind them. It is a beautiful monument. It's one of my favorites just because of the positioning of the soldier. It's very defiant and standing his ground against the Confederate invader of his state. If you look down between the men, where there's a divide between the men standing there, you will see a little black blob there on top of the monument. That's Sally. She is on the back side of the monument. So you drive up the road, which would be on the left of the photo. You can get out of your car and go around the back of the 11th Pennsylvania Monument, and there is Sally. And as you can see, people give Sally dog biscuits and treats and such for being a part of this. But Captain Henry B. Piper of the 11th Pennsylvania Volunteers said the following on the day that this monument was dedicated, which was September 3rd, 1890. So this is the year after Pennsylvania Day. Piper says, quote, "To him, the common soldier, to our dead comrades, whether here beneath his native soil he sleeps, or under the softer skies of the sunny Southland, we turn in grateful, tearful remembrance. We rear these monuments to their honor and in their memory. But in the unborn ages yet to come, long after we too shall have passed away, a saved and grateful republic will rear in history an everlasting memorial to their devotion and their valor, more changeless than brass and more enduring than marble, and that shall exist as long as these voiceless hills bear testimony to Gettysburg's fateful day." Again, it's like talking to a Second World War veteran and someone says, "You're a hero," and they say the heroes are over there. They didn't come home, or they're buried here and they didn't come home in 1945. You hear that again. It is a timeless thing where these men believe the true heroes are those who gave their lives in battle during the conflict. The 74th Pennsylvania Volunteers, again on the north end of Gettysburg, 11th Corps. This is one of my favorite monuments as well. They stood the brunt of the attacks on July 1st, 1863. On July 2nd, 1888, their monument was dedicated. And Captain Paul Rohrbacher spoke the following, quote, "The best way for us to appreciate the devotion of those who died for their country in the War of the Rebellion is to make it our duty to preserve what they sacrificed their lives to save." Again, synonymous over time. The 155th Pennsylvania Monument is intriguing because the base was installed in 1886. However, in 1889, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania allotted $1,500 to each regiment of the state to erect monuments. Some units already had monuments, so they placed a second one on the field, but the 155th said they were going to do something different. They placed a soldier in Zouave uniform even though they would not receive those uniforms until later in the war, on top of the original monument. Unit pride had dictated that since they were so proud of their late war uniforms, it would be placed on the battlefield where they had fought in the standard U.S. Army uniform, the sack coat and such. Sergeant John Kerr of the 155th spoke at the dedication of the monument, and he says, quote, "All over the land trodden by the Army of the Potomac, on the mountains and along the banks of the historic rivers, reposes the dust of our loved ones, embalmed in the bleeding hearts of mothers and enshrined in the archives of the nation. Each river is a memorial, and each hill and mountain a monument of their daring, and the rivers will be dried up and the mountains be leveled with the plains before the story of their valor is forgotten, or the result of that heroism ceases to affect mankind." So what do we see from all of this? We see that the good death standard was carried 20, 30 years after the war. Men were talking about valor. Men were talking about being with their comrades as they died as if it was family, because to them it was family. You rarely see a grotesque image on a Civil War monument because that was not the memory of the time. I often talk about First World War statuary in America. It's very much over the top. Let's go, follow me. But in Britain, it's very solemn and it's historical memory. It's the same with the American Civil War. This idea came from the 1650s of the Order of the Good Death. It allowed people to think about death in different ways. So we have to think about this on a grander scale than just antebellum years being 1845 to 1860 or 1860, and thinking that's where these men only came up with the ideas that they had during the war. These things were ancient ideas to these men before America was even a nation. And so we have to think of it in that regard. As I close out my PowerPoint presentation here, I want to do the stop share here and come back in and fill you in on a couple other things that I think are very, very important here. One is that we have to see this in the monumentation that we see around different battlefields and around different spots throughout the country. You can tell the historical memory from those areas. You can also tell by how long it takes some places to gather up their dead. And what I mean by that is you will see it takes 20 years sometimes for these bodies to be repatriated, as we would say today. It takes a long time for them to be repatriated because of the fact that you have a lot of money being incurred and you have a lot of time, and a lot of the southern states don't have that kind of time to do those kinds of things. So we have to think about that. Also, a lot of the burial pits were taken up in the 1880s, especially the Confederate burial pits on the Battle of Gettysburg, and shipped south to Richmond. You can go visit those remains at Hollywood Cemetery, and you will see a small headstone there. Well, it's not small, it's a nice large headstone, and it basically says in generic terms, "Here lies the dead of the Battle of Gettysburg." And I think it lists out the dates and such. You all have probably seen that. If you've been to Richmond, you've seen that before. That area is basically the large burial trenches off of the Pickett's Charge Field. So it's an amazing way to look at how they perceived death, and then also how they cleaned up afterwards, because sometimes people roved around the battlefield and picked up artifacts, and that's from first Bull Run to the end of the war. People were picking up artifacts, and that's how some of the museums started off after the war. You can see a lot through how they perceived death and how they perceived a good death and a good burial. And it's a really interesting topic. And this is a crash course, guys, in this. This is a 40-minute crash course into something which could take weeks and weeks and weeks. We could start in the 17th century and move forward to the Enlightenment, and then the Great Awakening, or excuse me, the First Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, and we can move forward. And the ideas of death suddenly change, and religious fervor and stuff like that. But this is something that really changed my outlook on interpretation, because I didn't want to be just someone else out there firing a weapon. I wanted to be someone who was talking about something that we all share, and that is we all have loss. We all have lost someone we've loved. And I think if we have that personal connection with the past, we have a better idea of what our ancestors went through. We will never, God willing, know the extent of the damage that they went through. And we're just now uncovering a lot of works on post-traumatic stress in the Civil War, because it's more widely accepted and more widely acknowledged now. But we have to look at all these factors when we look at death in the Civil War, burials, knowing that many of the battlefields that we visit even today still have people buried on them. So when you go to battlefields like Gettysburg, or even Antietam, or Chancellorsville, or Shiloh, or wherever it may be, you're probably within feet of someone buried there at some point. So that is a burial ground, and that's a holy site, not only to the veterans who fought there, but also to those descendants of those people, because maybe someone knows that their great-great-great-grandfather disappeared at the Battle of Shiloh. No idea where he went. He's probably still buried out there, or laying in an unknown grave in a cemetery. So that connection still resides within us. And when we talk about the order of the good death, we have to think about things that still impact us to this day, which they thought of as well. Dying in your sleep, dying peacefully, dying without pain. The hope of all this stuff goes back to 1651 in England with that one text, and it slowly starts to evolve into the way we think even to this day about last words and what we leave behind and such, and being surrounded by family at the last moment. So, as I said, this is a quick crash course. I know it's only 40 minutes, and I know it's a depressing subject for some of you, but I'm glad that you all tuned in. I thank you so much for listening.